Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. We've got a great program for you today. Mike Barra back with us, New York Times bestselling author, lecturer, screenwriter, and television personality. He began his writing career after spending more than 25 years as an engineering designer consultant for major aerospace companies, where he was a card-carrying member of the military-industrial complex. Mike is a self-described born-again conspiracy theorist. He's got documentaries out called The Secret Space Program, UFOs, and others. His books, Ancient Aliens and JFK, Lightbringer, and Dark Mission. Mike, welcome back. How have you been?
Hey, George, I've been great. I've been very busy, and it just doesn't seem like there's enough hours in the day to get all the things done I'm working on. So it's been a busy time. That was a really cheery news segment we had.
Oh my God!
Wow. When flesh-eating bacteria is like the highlight, then you're like, wow, that's not fun.
Guy eaten by insects in his cell for crying out loud.
Right? Yeah, I forgot about that one. Thanks for reminding me.
I'd get them all. Anyways, tell us about this new documentary.
Yeah, it's a really great documentary. It just came out. It's called Secret Space UFOs Apollo 1 to 11. And it's out on Amazon Prime and some other platforms like iTunes and Vudu and Apple TV. So you can get it there, Secret Space UFOs Apollo 1 through 11. Anyway, it was produced by a guy named Darcy Weir, who is a friend of mine, becoming a friend of mine, and is a really excellent producer and likes to do these kinds of documentaries. He's got some other ones he's planning on coming out with. And it's really just about the astronauts from the Apollo program and their various UFO sightings. And it's got me, it's got James Fox, it's got Richard Dolan, sort of the ultimate UFO power trio there.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah, well, I don't know who the guitarist is, but I know I'm not the drummer. We'll make Fox the drummer, and me and Dolan will be the guitar player and the bass player.
Nor are you the singer, right?
Yeah, well, probably not, George. I'm not the singer that you are, but I don't know. We hear this stuff about these med beds. Maybe I'll have a singing voice after that. Maybe I can ask him to give me, Simon Le Bon's singing voice or something.
You never know. Well, yeah, you and I both knew Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, walked on the moon. Mm-hmm. Edgar, in all his discussions with me, never admitted that he saw a UFO. He did tell me that he was told by people in government, these are real, these are happening. But he never told me directly he saw something. Did he ever tell you anything?
No, he never came through with that. And Ed Mitchell is in the documentary, and his story is covered in that. Never. And in fact, he was very harshly critical. I remember there was an old show with him and my co-author on Dark Mission, and
Mr. Hoagland,
who called me the other day by accident. So
yeah, he was on a couple weeks ago on the program.
Yeah, and Ed was really harshly critical of Richard's moon information, especially the stuff about the glass structures. But of course now, there's all kinds of new confirmations of that coming out. So it's kind of like, did he know something, or did he? And was he just towing the company line? But he's also doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who toes the company line. He pushed the limits quite a bit, including that psychic experiment that he did when he was on the moon that not that many people know about.
That's right. He did a psychic experiment on the way from Earth to the moon, where he tried to do some kind of psychic powers, seeing if it would transfer throughout the cosmos. And
I thought I would leave that hanging there. So.
And then he started the Noetic Institute.
Right, exactly. Which I quote a lot in my book, The Choice. I talk a lot about some of their work. What he actually did was I think he was actually he did some stuff on the way to the moon, and when he was on the surface of the moon, he told I don't know 5 or 6 friends. This is like a remote viewing experiment. He told 5 or 6 friends, all right, at a certain time, I'm going to think about something in my mind, and I want you guys to draw a picture of what you get. And I forget what it was, a flower or something, but every single person on Earth that was, supposed to be tuned in at that time drew exactly what he was thinking about. And he went back and showed his original, I think it was like an original thing. He had drawn something and got it in his mind, and they all picked it up. So that's pretty amazing. And for him to talk about that and be that open about it, he's a man of great contradictions. Born in Roswell, New Mexico.
That's right, exactly. The fact, though, that he didn't see anything, what does that tell you about the other Apollo missions?
Well, for one thing, it tells me he might not be telling the truth.
I'm not sure he'd lie to us, Mike.
Well, I agree with you, but you have to remember that the other Apollo missions, this is really interesting, because there is a certain amount of brainwashing or something that went on with the astronauts, I think. Richard and I talked about that in Dark Mission, and this is also in the documentary. It's in Secret Space UFOs, Apollos 1 through 11. It's in the documentary where we talk about the fact that there appear to be problems with their memories. And it's really interesting because as you go through, the different documents and stuff of what these guys said, the debriefings, they can tell you chapter and verse. At this time I did this. At this time I did this. At this time I made, stellar observations through the telescope. And at this time I put out the ALSEP experiment. But for instance, Buzz Aldrin had a really hard time. He was asked on a national TV interview on NBC, I think around 1970, what did it feel like to be on the moon? And he had a panic attack and ran out of the interview, live interview.
I remember that.
And threw up, and then, there's a really interesting story that at a JPL event that Richard was doing, that this lady came up and she said, I was part of those debriefings of all the astronauts for Apollo 11. And she, talked about her credentials and showed him some stuff. And she said, we hypnotized all of the astronauts to help them remember the details. And then he said, well, okay, well, tell me more about that. And she kind of stumbled and she said, well, come to think of it, I can't really remember much about what was said.
Yeah, they probably hypnotized her too.
Exactly. So, there was a lot of stuff. And I think the strongest case for that, George, is really Al Bean. If you look at Alan Bean, Apollo 12, fourth man on the moon. And when he got back to Earth, he became an artist, right? He started painting. And he painted himself a self-portrait of himself on the moon. And it was all gray and boring, right? But it bothered him, and he didn't like it. And he said, so I just kept doing more and more iterations of my self-portrait on the moon, and it got all the way to the point where he started painting the background in these pinks and purples and greens and blues and lavenders. And again, if the glass structure model that Hoagland came up with way back in 1994, if that's real, that's exactly what you would expect to see, because you've got light bouncing all the way through all these different panes of, let's call it glass or crystal or whatever. And you're going to get a prismatic effect. So you're going to get all these different colors. And then when you enhance the pictures of these guys actually on the lunar surface, you see exactly that. You see that the actual color of the moon is multicolored, multi-hued with all of this very, very odd prismatic color. So, I think that shows that Al Bean had a hard time remembering what the moon really looked like. And he finally came out, finally got it out in his paintings.
How did you come across this kind of information, Mike, to the point of doing the documentary?
Well, again, you went through stuff like the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, which is actually just a massive treasure trove of information. And Darcy Weir, the producer, he did a lot of work going through that, going through the old motion picture footage, obviously the photographs from the Hasselblad cameras. And then, there was a item that was basically, it's like a black box that was carried on the Apollo missions. And you got into some of the transcripts of that dialogue, stuff that was never heard in public at the time. And, all these records exist, but you have to go back and go through reams and reams and reams. And, you got to kind of know what you're looking for. That helps a lot. But, yeah, you got to go back and just reconstruct all this stuff from these old sources, which are available online, most of them these days. And I'm sure there's some alterations there, George, but a lot of it's real. And I think there's so much weirdness involved with the Apollo missions that it's actually pretty easy for stuff to slip through the cracks.
Well, didn't the Apollo 11 astronauts talk about something in the foreground that they saw on the moon? And we could never quite understand what it was then. But what do you think that was?
Well, the rumor is, and this comes, I think, from David Adair and some other folks, that they saw massive flying saucers, on the rim of a crater. I don't know what crater they're talking about because, to me, Apollo 11 there weren't really too many big craters there. But supposedly there were 3 of them on the rim of this crater, like observing them the entire time after they landed. And that Armstrong commented on this and said, they were huge and they were really scary, and that they communicated this information back through their private channels. Now, I will say this, they're private channels, and they did have them, so they could talk to their doctor or whatever if they were having, space gas or something that you didn't want to project over the public airwaves. But they said there are UFOs here on the moon, and it's really scary, and what do you want us to do about it? And that the thing about that story is, George, is that you go back, and I talked to Ken Johnston Jr., who I know you know, and a guy named Marvin Zarnik, who used to work at Douglas and was personal friends with Buzz Aldrin for years. And they both told me that story that Armstrong radioed back and said, there's UFOs out here with us on the crater. What do you want us to do? That story was ripping through NASA. Ken Johnston and Marv Zarnik, 2 people I knew that worked at NASA back in the 60s, and Marv was close personal friends with Buzz Aldrin for more than 20 years, told me that within 30 minutes of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon at Tranquility Base, that story about the 3 UFOs parked on the crater rim was rifling through NASA. Like, everybody was walking through the hallway saying, hey, did you hear what Neil said? He said, they saw there's UFOs up there and all this other stuff. There's aliens up there and all this, just over and over again. And that tells me that the story is probably true, George, because, when rumors like that come around at the time, then that's word of mouth that's happening, in situ at the moment. So I think that there's a really good chance that story is actually true. And but what we don't know is, some people have tried to put a really negative spin on it, that they ordered us off the moon and told us never to come back again, and that's why we haven't been back. Well, we went back 5 more times. So I don't think that really adds up. But it does seem like, and that's what we talk about in this documentary, what Darcy Weir put in the documentary is stories like that, and, the Apollo 11 UFO sighting they had on the way to the moon, all kinds of interesting stuff that's kind of been kept secret for years.
Mike, did you get an official statement from NASA for the documentary?
No, we didn't really get anything from them officially, but what are they going to say officially?
They still haven't said anything officially.
No, one of the things I'm doing, George, is I'm writing for a TV show, a YouTube channel called The Y-Files, WHY, The Y-Files, and they're really super awesome. It's hosted by a guy named AJ Gentili, and he has this little animated goldfish called Hecklefish with a tinfoil hat that heckles him. And they do about 30-minute videos on all kinds of cool subjects like that you talk about on Coast to Coast. He's a huge Coast to Coast fan. In fact, you should probably have them on. They got like 2 million subscribers on this channel.
Wow.
Last year. I mean, it's amazing. So the show has just taken off, and I'm doing some writing for them, and I did one on Solar Warden, the secret space program. But what I'm working on right now is the face on Mars, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what it's reminding me of is I'm going back and I'm piecing this story together and trying to tell it in 30 minutes to a young audience that's never heard of it. It's just how many times NASA lied, how many times they didn't tell the truth, how many times they manipulated information to make it look like the face was not artificial. And I'm totally convinced at this point that it is. But it's like, when I look at that history, and it really goes up right up to 2005 or 2006, which is kind of when we stopped arguing about the face because I think it was so obvious that it was artificial. But, looking at that track record, I don't think we're ever going to get much official out of NASA. I think if there's disclosure of any kind, it's probably going to come through the private space ventures.
I think you're right. Now, how did you line up the great researchers and filmmaker James Fox and the great ufologist Richard Dolan?
Well, Darcy had contacts with them. Fox has obviously been doing a lot of documentaries himself. And the interesting thing was that this perspective on this documentary on the secret space UFOs one was right up his alley because he had an adventure with Buzz Aldrin, gosh, I think almost 10 years ago, where he was going to meet him and Buzz was going to spill the beans. And so he tells that story in the documentary. And, he's a very busy guy. He's in Washington right now trying to get some congressmen to talk on the record about disclosure. Although I'm pessimistic about government disclosure, but he's trying to get them on the record to talk about this stuff, to investigate this stuff in greater detail. And Richard is he's just one of those guys that's just very serious and very solid about what he does. He doesn't make very many mistakes, and he stays very much in the realm of the probable, and he documents stuff. And, he kind of reminds me of Stanton Friedman in some ways, because Stan, was the best documentarist.
Yes, he was.
Who went, I've got this paper and that paper and all that stuff. And I'm too lazy to do that. Once I know something and I know it's real, I don't really keep track of where do I get that exactly, because I know it's true. It's a true fact. I'm a little lazy in that sense. But to have them on the documentary sort of adds gravitas to the whole thing. And they tell some fascinating stories. I mean, James Fox's story about Buzz is bizarre. I mean, he had a meeting arranged with Buzz Aldrin in Monaco, of all places, where he flew out there to meet with them, and he gets to the hotel, and there's a message from Buzz. They were agreeing to do an interview. He says, I'm not going to do an interview. So then he called up to his room and said, dude, come on, I flew all the way to Monaco, and I want to do this interview, and this is really important for the human race. And Buzz just basically said, look, they've threatened my family and threatened people that are close to me, and I don't know what good it will do to tell my story at this point. And that was 10 years ago. So I would give anything to get Buzz on the record, because not only did he have these UFO sightings, the one that he's publicly talked about on the way to the moon, he also, I want to ask him about the ceremony that they performed in the lunar module before he and Neil went out on the first spacewalk. There's so much to ask him. And there's, not very many of these guys left, George.
Just don't ask him to swear on a Bible.
Well, if I do, I'll put up my left hand to stop that right cross from coming in. That was a pretty good shot, actually.
Well, I could understand how he got offended when somebody said you didn't go to the moon. I mean, the guy risked his life for America, and for somebody to embarrass him like that was crazy.
It is, and especially since, who was it, Bart Sibrel? I mean, most of this stuff is just nonsense. It's just so dumb. And, I don't see that as, meaning that Buzz, felt guilty or was trying to hide. I just think he got PO'd at the guy and gave him what he deserved, because, I mean, he did risk his life, and so did the other guys. And,
And some did.
And some did. Yeah, some did lose their lives. The Apollo 1 astronauts absolutely lost their lives trying to get us to the moon, and it's a disrespect for those guys that I think is just really not. It's not right, and they deserve better than that. I don't think that they're lying about what they saw or didn't see there. I think there's some guys that have signed these agreements where they can't talk about things that they've seen, but that's not something I'm going to criticize them for. I mean, if I had people threatening the ones that I loved, and you can't say this or they're going to be killed, that's a pretty heavy burden to carry. And I think, as we discussed earlier, I think actually most of the reason why you don't get a lot more disclosure out of the astronauts is because of the brainwashing effect more than anything else.
How do people see this new DVD documentary?
Well, you can catch it on Amazon Prime. Again, it's Secret Space UFOs Apollo 1 through 11. Go to Amazon Prime. It's on iTunes. It's on Vudu and Apple TV, and it's going to be on lots of other streaming sources. So you can pick it up on all of those different services. And it really would be good if you did it because, Darcy and the guys, he wants to make more documentaries. And I think it's important that we get these things made and get information out to people. Because, George, let's face it, you got to retell the same old stories every 5 years because you got a new generation coming along
that's true.
That doesn't know any of this stuff.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. What are you working on now besides the documentary that just came out?
Well, I'm working, like I said, I'm doing some writing for the Y-Files. I've got 2 assignments there. And so some of my work's going to be showing up on their channel in the next couple of weeks. I'm working on the Ark of the Covenant and the Face on Mars. And I really, really want to do Stanley Kubrick, and the moon landings. But we'll see if they let me do that or not. So I'm doing that. And then I have appearances coming up. I'm going to be going to, I just got done with Roswell in March. And I'm going to be going to Spruce Pine UFO Festival, UFO Expo, actually, with Tom Reed on June the 10th in North Carolina. That's going to be really fun. And then I'm going to be doing show in Las Vegas and in September, and then another one in Barcelona, Spain. I get to go to Spain this year. So I'm, I got a lot of things on my plate. The writing is going on. I'm not working on any books because I just feel like I got to wait and see how this whole this whole thing that the whole world is going through right now ends before I have any more thoughts to add to it.
You think with the release of the Tic Tac videos, there's more interest in UFOs these days by general people?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now I have my personal opinions about what is on those videos, and I'm not really that enthusiastic about them as alien spacecraft. But what I will say is that it's absolutely increased the interest, and how can it not? Because the government and the media have gone out of their way to make a big deal out of it, which is, a big change from what we experienced, for the last 20, 30, 40 years. It's completely different. So it used to be that it was a real fringe subject, and now it's not so much anymore. Really, since the X-Files came along, it's gotten really mainstream. But now you see people talking about this stuff all the time. I mean, there's a whole, what was that term they came up with that I refuse to use?
UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Right. And actually, I found out Nick Pope was the guy who came up with that, which makes me want to use it even less. I was teasing Nick. I'm like, well, now that I know you came up with it, I'm not going to use it at all. But, it's the government trying to change the language. And so that's become there's a UAP Twitter out there, and that's all they talk about is these videos. Absolutely.
Now, what do you think the Tic Tac videos may depict?
Well, I think a lot of these are drone aircraft, probably Chinese or Russian that we're picking up. They also, I think, in a couple cases of those, those TTSA videos, the videos from the To the Stars Academy folks that they got from the Pentagon. Those all took place, George, in naval weapons testing grounds. Okay.
That's true. That's true.
I think some of them were ours. I mean, the gimbal UFO thing to me looks like a drone, like an X-47B, which is a project I worked on around that time in 2003. It's a winged aircraft that you're looking at from the top, and the Tic Tac stuff. It's really interesting because when you go into the videos, it's like the reports that we get about these objects don't match the video that we're seeing. It's like the video is only a small part of it. So I don't know. I feel like there's a narrative here and an agenda that's being pushed forward. And you know me, I'm always skeptical about anything the government puts forward like that.
Oh, that's true. But if they're drones, they're pretty darn fast.
Well, yeah, but some of them, like that Tic Tac. I did a video about this, and this is what I talk about. My current presentation this year is what I'm talking about. The Tic Tac, they say, well, it zooms off to the left of the screen, and actually what happens is there's a zoom factor on the camera, and the camera just zooms up, and they lose the lock, and I don't think it really moves at all. But the other thing, too, is, look, let's face reality. We've talked about this before on this show on, like, books I did, like Hidden Agenda back in 2016. We've had UFO anti-gravity technology, I think probably since 1958, when we really figured out how to do it. And, I think it goes all the way back to Art's parts and those parts that Linda Moulton Howe has. I think that's all T. Townsend Brown technology that's been developed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So these could be ours. I think they could be our craft that we're just messing with our own military to see how they react to this stuff.
Mike, tell us another story of one of the Apollo astronaut missions that caught your eye.
Well, I think the one here that's most compelling is really the story that Buzz tells, which actually didn't just happen to him. It happened to him and Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins, which is that after they got to translunar injection and they were on their way to the moon, the first day, near the end of the day, they were looking out the window and they saw this glowing object following them, and it was kind of paralleling them at the same speed. And they thought, well, this is really weird. It shouldn't be the S-4B, which is the third stage of the Apollo rocket.
Right.
It shouldn't be there. So they called up NASA on the private channel, which is another way you know that they had private channels. And they said, on the public channel, they said, do you guys know where the S-4B is? Because they couldn't say, well, we've got a UFO
following us. Yeah.
Right. And they said, well, it should be 5,000 miles behind you, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And they're like, that thing ain't 5,000 miles away. It's a lot closer than that. So they kept watching it, and it seemed to just be paralleling them. And finally they kind of said, well, we're just going to have to go to sleep because it was their sleep cycle. And they did. They went to sleep, and when they got up the next day, it was gone. But there was something in there in space that was trailing them. And not falling behind, which means it can't be the third stage. It was not falling behind, for hours and hours. And I think that's a really compelling story that comes straight from Buzz. I mean, that's one he did talk about. And
why did you stop at 11, Michael? You could have kept going.
Well, I think this is about the early Apollo missions in Georgia, and I think that Darcy's going to probably do another documentary, a follow-up, where we're going to look at the other missions. But it's a huge, exhausting process to go through all of this information. You gotta look at the black box transcripts and the weird stuff about hearing music on the dark side of the moon kind of thing. There's a lot to go through. So I think it's just a question of you got to break it up into 2 or 3 different chapters to get all the great stories out.
Do you think the Apollo astronauts were compelled to sign non-disclosure agreements?
Well, that's been implied. You remember when John Glenn was on the Frasier TV series back in 2003? That was a super popular sitcom at the time. And that's basically what he said. He did this thing where he goes off on a tangent in the radio studio, and he starts just talking into the microphone while there's a fight going on in the background. And he starts telling people that they were all like forced to lie, that they were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. And so, yeah, I actually think that that's very viable. And that's what Buzz said to James Fox. Now, I don't think that James is a liar. I think he's telling the absolute truth about his conversation with Buzz, that, we signed this agreement, and he told me if I break it, they're going to go after my family. So I think it's absolutely true.
Well, and when you do sign a non-disclosure agreement, you are subject to the penalties if you break the agreement.
You are, and that's why you always want an NDA that has an expiration date, right? I guess, but yeah, it's those things are binding till the end. Well, I mean, let's look at an example. There's a certain former performer who owes a certain former president $621,000 because she broke a non-disclosure agreement. So yeah, they're binding, and they're absolutely enforceable.
It is truly remarkable. What do you think now that the Soviet Union has collapsed and Russia's doing what it's doing? What are they doing with space other than taking astronauts up to the ISS?
Not much, and it's really interesting because Russia is obviously engaged in the conflict in
Ukraine.
Well, what used to be Russia, but now it's Ukraine, right? That's taken up a lot of their resources, so their space program has really taken a back seat, as you just observed. So I don't know what the plan is there. I know that from what I understand about the political situation is that this is going to take focus. This is going to be their focus for the next few years. So I don't see any advancement really in their space program for quite a while, unless they get it in their heads, unless Vlad gets it in his head that he wants to embarrass the United States even more than he already has by exposing stuff, because that's certainly, they're certainly in a position to send spacecraft as the Chinese have done. And I don't know if you talked about this when you had Richard on the other day, but a couple months ago. But, when they landed on the backside of the moon, they took more images that showed this glass structure stuff on the far side of the moon. Russia could do the same thing. They could fly probes to Mars. They could fly probes to the moon, and they could take really good, honest pictures of a lot of this stuff and send them back and just really put the United States on their back heels. So that might be part of the agenda. It just depends. It's a very volatile, obviously, political situation in Europe right now. Plus, it's getting older, and we all slip a little bit as we get older. But, he's sharp as a tack when he's recounting these stories. And obviously, it made a huge impression on him, and we have no reason to question his integrity about this. So I'm glad, sir, that you finally got some confirmation. Watch the documentary. It's all in there.
What got you so excited about space, Mike? I know you were in the engineering area for years, but why about space and this angle you've gone? And I'm glad you have, but what got you interested?
Well, I don't know, Coast to Coast AM. I don't know. George, that question I get a lot. And, I met Bill Mooney, Will Robinson.
Great guy, by the way.
Space. Wonderful guy. At one of the alien cons in like 2018, and we were talking about that, and I said, Bill, I didn't get into this whole space and aliens thing because I watched Lost in Space or because I watched Star Trek. I was already into it. I mean, George, I was born this way. I was born to explore space and aliens and space travel, and that's why I watched those shows when I was a kid. And that's why I watched all the rocket launches. I mean, some of my earliest memories is a black and white TV memory of one of the Gemini missions where the engine started and then they cut it off right away, and that's embedded in my mind. So why is a 4, 5, 6-year-old watching this stuff on TV? I don't know, but I was born this way, and that's all I can tell you.
That's fantastic.
It got me started.
That's what got me into broadcasting. When I was 11 years old, I decided I wanted to unravel UFO stories because my mother brought me home a book called We Are Not Alone by Walter Sullivan. Look Magazine did the Interrupted Journey with Barney and Betty Hill, and I said the only way I can get answers is to be a news person or a journalist, because I can't do it if it was just George Norrie, some kid calling people. So I'm going into broadcasting, Mom, when I grow up. And she said, all right, Georgie, go for it. And here I am.
Yeah, exactly. That your life was defined at that moment. And, if you want to go into really a deeper spiritual aspect of this, I mean, look, we all come into these lives with a plan, right? And even the people that we meet along the way, I think, is to a certain extent planned. And, that was your path to get to this truth, and mine was whatever it ended up being. I didn't really get serious about the UFO research aspect of it or the alien research until I was older. And I'd already kind of finished my career. I mean, I was always interested in it, but in terms of actually being a part of it, it started really late for me. And for you, it started, from the time you were a kid. And
yeah.
Who knows? You just got to follow the easiest path. The easiest path in life to follow is the one you should be on.
Let's go to Brendan in Austin, Texas. Welcome to the show. Hey, Brendan.
Hey, thank you so much, George and Mike. And I got to thank everybody for listening. And the people of China, Iran, Israel, and the whole world, we all just want peace. The whole world just wants peace and freedom. So thank you for saying that also at the beginning.
You're welcome.
And so I had a question for you, Mike, if we have time at the end, about your opinion on something. But I just wanted to muse on the Apollo crew's memory real quick. So the Apollo crew was having these issues with their memory, and Art Bell had a couple interviews where he asked about that. And he also had mentioned how the astronauts had issues with drinking, divorce, and violence, just kind of indicative of suppressing things or lies or trauma. And I think it was Buzz possibly who said that he can't remember the emotions of the flight and the mission because he had such intense training to keep him calm in space so that they didn't have a panic attack in space and die. It sounds like that almost happened, even despite his training. But then he has an interview, or Edgar has an interview where he has this trauma response of having a panic attack and running out at a simple question. Then Buzz gets a simple question and has a trauma response and ends up hitting another human being. And they're saying that they have intense training to keep themselves calm in space, but they can't stay calm during an interview. And with Edgar Mitchell, on the flip side, that was the interview where he was emotionally numbed out. But on the flip side, there was another interview with Walter Link he did where he talked about he was really emotional on the way back and he had this epiphany. And the exact quote, he said, "Perhaps the story of ourselves as told by science was incomplete or flawed." And he went back to Earth and immediately delved into India and Sanskrit and 5,000-year-old description of his experience emotionally called samadhi. And I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that, but it basically, when he came back and went into Graham Hancock type stuff and advanced aliens and stuff. But my question is, if you want to talk about it, as Mike, as a 25-year engineering consultant, do you have any opinion on the story of Phil Schneider, who is also an engineering consultant that talked about the underground Dulce base and a war with aliens and stuff like that?
Do I have an opinion about it? No, the stories have been around for years, and they make a lot of sense. There was a device called a nuclear submarine, which was basically fairly miniaturized nuclear reactor that heated up this device that basically carved through rock, kind of like, remember that Star Trek episode, George, with the Hornet? It looked like a sausage pizza.
Yeah.
It can eat its way through rock, right?
Way back.
And it's kind of the same thing. And it leaves a glass seal on it, and these huge tunnels. And they built these things. I mean, there's pictures of them in the 1970s, and so I think all those stories are very probably true. The problem with so many stories in the UFO lore is that there's not anything except the stories. I lean towards. I had a chance to spend some time with Whitley Strieber and Richard Doty in Manchester last October, and the thing is, those guys, they have a lot of stories, but they also have evidence that these things happened. There's supporting evidence. The stuff like the Dulce base, the story's been out there forever. It may have happened. My opinion is that it probably did happen, or something like it happened. But they become the thing of myth, George. They become these stories that we repeat over and over again, but we don't know if they're really true or not. But they are pretty scary. I mean, that's a scary story that this alien got out and started vaporizing people. That's the Dulce thing is, but it's probably true because the technology was there to have built all these deep underground military bases. Absolutely.
As we claim land when we get there first. Why didn't we do that with the moon?
Well, personally, I think we did. I think that's what Buzz Aldrin's ceremony was. He took a Masonic apron with him to the moon to perform a ceremony with. He talked about in his biographies, both of them, that and Neil Armstrong confirmed this in his biography, that they did a little thing with wine and chalices and broke bread and stuff. And this all sounds Christian, but it actually has its root in ancient Egypt. And, the Freemasons, they're all focused on ancient Egyptian religions. So they did perform. I think they did consecrate the moon as a temple. I think that's what the mission of Apollo 11 really was. And, George, I think that's why there's no pictures of Neil Armstrong on the moon. All the pictures of from Apollo 11, they're all Buzz Aldrin. They were all taken by Neil. There's no pictures of Neil Armstrong on the moon, just Buzz Aldrin. And I actually argue that's why Buzz went out second, was so that Neil could photograph him.
Interesting.
First Freemason to walk on the surface of the moon.
Why did Neil stay so silent when he came back?
Well, that's interesting. He's a shy person anyway. He wasn't really a very talkative guy, and he wasn't big for the press and all that kind of thing. I don't think he liked the press very much. And, everybody always show you the footage of the press conference, the official Apollo 11 press conference, and how serious and dour Neil and Buzz and Michael Collins were. And the truth is that not much scared Neil Armstrong, if you get into it, except talking to the press, because he was always concerned that they would distort what he said into something different, which, a lot of the press really does do that kind of thing. So when I look at that, what I see is these three guys who've done this incredible thing, but who are very nervous, really, about being in front of the press. And again, let's face it, George, we already know they saw a UFO on the way to the moon. I think they were all under pressure not to reveal the truth. So when I look at that, I don't think, oh, well, they faked it and we never went to the moon. I think they went to the moon and they saw some things they're not allowed to talk about, and they're repressing that. And I think that accounts for their attitude. And the easiest way to keep an NDA if you're Neil Armstrong, is to just never talk to anybody. And that's practically what he did. He had very few interviews, very few things that he did in terms of press after the initial Apollo 11 tour. And even then, he hardly commented. I mean, he was the quiet one. So Collins and Buzz were a lot more evocative when it came to, telling stories and talking about stuff.
We get texts and tweets for you, Michael. Tom, what do you have for Mike?
Hey, Mike, Randy in Salt Lake City would like you to talk about heat shields, reentry, and the dangers that they have when they do come back.
Well, okay, when you're coming back from space, I mean, your speed can be, anywhere up to about, I think, 17,000 miles an hour when you're returning from translunar space. Because you have to remember that the spacecraft, they would fire their rockets and then they accelerate to like the midpoint where gravity takes over. Well, they accelerate for a little while, but then after the burn, they coast, and coast to coast, George. And then as they come back in towards Earth, their speed increases because the gravitational pull is pulling the spacecraft towards the Earth. So they speed up and speed up and speed up. And so that was the toughest thing I think they had to do. The biggest challenge is how do you make this craft survive these incredible temperatures of thousands of degrees centigrade and Fahrenheit, and they came up with this ablative surface that like one layer peels off, heat resistant layer peels off, and then there's another, and then there's another, and the idea is that you don't peel off all of them, so everybody survives. And of course there were Russian missions where the heat shield failed and they lost the crew. And
yeah, that was horrible.
There's horrible radio recordings of those things. So it's not an exact science, and I think we're pretty fortunate.
Mike, what's your best website for people to get to?
MikeBarra.blogspot.com. I still got an old blogspot. I looked at doing some other sites, but this is the simplest, easiest way to find me. And you can just use Google and type in my name, and it should be the first or second one that comes up after some page attacking me.
Mike, Apollo 8, 1968, as it was circling the moon, Jim Lovell, one of the astronauts, said, please be informed there is a Santa Claus, of which many people thought he was making reference to a UFO. Remember that?
I absolutely remember that. And I'm not sure he wasn't. I mean, I think it does sound like code. and other people have argued that it was a coded transmission. And, yeah, I think it probably was, George, because what a great way to get away with it. What a great way to get away with it is that around Christmas time, because on Christmas Eve they read from the book of Genesis.
That's right.
It was an amazing moment. So yeah, I remember that. I remember hearing that, and they didn't really say, "Oh, he's talking about you can see Santa Claus from space." It's like they said that in the middle of the conversation for no reason, with no context.
Yep. Please be informed. There is a Santa Claus.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Kubrick, most people don't know this, but Kubrick could quote from the Brookings Report chapter and verse. I mean, there's a Playboy interview, and I only read Playboy magazine for the articles, George, just so everybody knows.
Okay, I agree.
And he quoted long passages of the Brookings Report, which is a report that basically told NASA, you're probably not going to run into ET out there, although it sounds like they did. But you might find artifacts. You might find ruins. You might find, instruments. You might find tools. And if you do, you should seriously consider not telling anybody about it, because it will drive them crazy. And that's the basis for the Hal story. I mean, Hal went crazy because he was told that they, had discovered artifacts from a previously advanced civilization, and he couldn't tell anybody about it, so it made him nuts. So there's all kinds of cool messages in both of those films along those lines, and I think Arthur C. Clarke definitely knew and understood this stuff. I believe Clarke is somebody who would have read that Brookings Report to NASA cover to cover, absolutely, and so did Kubrick, quite obviously.
Remember Kubrick's movie Eyes Wide Shut?
Oh, yeah.
It's another strange one, wasn't it?
Well, I think he was telling you then, how does Hollywood really work? What's the first thing he did when he got the leverage to make his own films and control his own films? He moved the hell out of Hollywood and went straight to London. So, interesting. The YouTube channel, the Y-Files, I mean, they got 2 million subscribers talking about all this stuff, and there's little 30-minute episodes that they do, and that's a sign that everything is taking off, the popularity of the X-Files. So people are awake, and they're waking up steadily, slowly, but surely, which, by the way, speaking of the Brookings Report, George, that's exactly what it suggested, is that you use popular culture to get everybody comfortable with the idea of there being aliens and that they might be superior to us technologically in some way. So, I mean, I think we're living it, and I don't agree. I don't agree that we're primitive or that we're not advanced. I think we have a very special condition here, a very special spiritual orientation on this planet, and it takes a lot of courage to be born into this life, because you don't get to remember heaven. You don't get to remember where you came from. You have to live here all by yourself. You have to come here all by yourself. And so I kind of disagree with that from a spiritual perspective. But what I would say is I see the country and the world waking up all the time, year by year. Although I got to be honest, George, I think we've kind of reached I think we've reached the Roche limit. I think we've reached the limit here. I see the people that don't want to know really becoming entrenched in their positions. And I think now we have to decide how are we going to go forward with them or without them, because I don't know that we're going to reach that many more people at this point. I really don't.
Michael, would you consider yourself very spiritual?
Yeah, in a non-religious way, but yeah, I mean, for instance, I absolutely believe Jesus existed and that he was the Son of God and all that stuff, but I'm not a practicing Christian. I don't go to church. So, yeah, I do. And, I wrote a book back in 2010 called The Choice, which is all about how you connect the science, the physics, to these spiritual belief systems that the hippies have. And they actually do connect, and there actually is science behind all of it. And that's something I'd like to help educate people more on. But, yeah, I am. But sometimes you get messages and you don't know what the heck you're supposed to do with it, right? So that's happened to me a few times here lately. Like, okay, great, I got that there's a message here. Just what are you trying to tell me? I wish things were clearer, George. I really do. And I remember in Albuquerque when Richard first showed me that, it just blew me out of my seat because as you build up to this is in Shorty Crater. It's Apollo 17. The caller's correct. It's in a crater called Shorty Crater. There's several pictures of it, and there's all this mechanical stuff around it. And then you see this thing which actually looks like C-3PO. Looks more like C-3PO, but he called it Data's head because there was.
I remember that. Yeah. I remember that.
And I mean, this thing is incredible, and it looks like a mechanical head of a robot. It's the right size. It's everything perfect for it to be a humanoid robot. I don't think it was living biological tissue because in the very harsh radiation environment of the moon, it would have deteriorated by now, even if it had only been there a few years. And it probably had been there for, hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of years. So I do think it's mechanical, and Richard did multiple enhancements of it, and it's a phenomenal find. And, I'm not sure that's not one of the things they brought back in the diplomatic beds, from the moon, and did some reverse engineering on. I'm sure they did, or at least stuff like that. So that's a fascinating artifact.
Michael, once again, how can people watch Secret Space UFOs? You
can go to all of the usual suspects. You can go to Amazon Prime. You can go to iTunes. You can go to Vudu. You can go to all these different places and pick up this information. Where's the other one? Apple TV. Apple TV.
Oh, great.
And also MikeBarra.blogspot.com. It's on there. And, George, I'm back on Twitter. They've let me back on Twitter.
Good.
Mike Barra 333. Find me on Twitter. I would appreciate it.
See you around one of these events up here in the future, Michael. Thank you for being on the program. The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial.